Thank you. Good afternoon. I have a lot of things in my hands, so I hope I can manage this. So good afternoon. I've been introduced and asked to speak about landscape perceptions, preferences, and lessons from governing multifunctional landscapes, which you learned about in the morning session. Governing, maybe you can help me advance the slides. No, that's 2 slides too many. Okay, let's just start here. So the Governing Multifunctional Landscapes project in Ghana, it's a project that spans many countries, was formerly called Territorial Approaches to Zero Deforestation Commodities. But times and buzzwords change, and we'll talk about that in our debate this afternoon. And we're now closer to working on jurisdictional approaches to climate-smart commodities, where we're piloting a jurisdictional approach to map and monitor land use transitions and develop models for improved service delivery. So this is a dynamic landscape. I'll just keep talking while it catches up. With a biodiversity hotspot surrounded by cocoa, oil palm, rubber, artisanal mills, and mining. At first, we of course aim to map the crop drivers of deforestation, but the transitions from forest to crops is slight in this area compared to other regions, even cocoa. And more often we are seeing land use transitions between crops, because farmers in this landscape have choices about how to engage with value chains, crops, markets, business models, informal, formal sector. And we are seeing these transitions in the medium to short term through the spatialization of specific commodity activities. Next slide. Okay, so our work plan for this integrated approach to landscape governance and management takes steps to map land use and land use transitions, identify barriers and constraints for adopting climate-smart practices and location technologies, and looks for opportunities and levers for transitions to sustainable intensification. Click. And our approach is, of course, through multi-stakeholder platforms. Next slide. In addition to analyzing farmer adoption and decision-making aspirations and optimization modeling of different pathways, we are interested in understanding how this landscape is produced, reproduced, or transitioning. And we begin by understanding the different stakeholder perceptions of the landscape from their everyday lived experiences of landscape or from a distant government office with responsibility over that space. So there's a human component to this involving past experiences, knowledge, expectations. There's a landscape component involving landscape features and landscapes as a whole. And then there are the landscape effects and the outcomes of the human environment interaction. Next slide. So we know that land use mapping itself is a discursive practice that produces meaning through the categorization and spatialization of nature. They fix categories in time and space, obscuring the processes and the power dynamics behind selective classifiers. There are consequences for the categories that mappers choose to represent on the landscape. The land use classifiers that are selectively rendered inevitably leave off other parts of the map that are relevant to other stakeholders. They're unaccounted for. They're off the map. There are methods and approaches for eliciting landscape perceptions. And from our project, we have household surveys. We have focus group discussions where we've discussed landscape histories, landscape trajectories. And then we also have a process of doing 3-dimensional landscape modeling, where we worked with those living in the landscape to develop the land use categories. So what's especially challenging is that landscape perceptions are slippery and they're not fixed, and that they can be molded by project participation, extension messaging, and interventions. Next slide, please. So this brings us to landscape perceptions and closer to planning for agricultural landscape futures. This is the nut that we are trying to crack right now. Our landscape preferences have to do with affinity for certain landscape features and their arrangement. It's the physical, social, and aesthetic dimensions which are influenced by where you grew up, your culture, and indeed what you've been taught. So for farmers, landscape preferences shift with training as they do with other stakeholder groups, and it's difficult to separate innate preferences from what is normal at the time. Can I take one more minute? We don't have virtual reality to play with in our landscape. We don't have that kind of funding. So we have to work with scenarios, and we have to work with work. From a theoretical perspective, from a social construction of knowledge perspective, what is important is that the planning process is to create a process, structure, and methodology to elicit subjective preferences of individuals. So all of these little dots are different people's landscape perceptions. If we can't work with individuals, we work with homogeneous stakeholder groups, and we follow their implementation pathways, the landscape trajectories and effects along these pathways to their desirable landscape futures. Next slide. And just keep clicking through the slide. So building our multi-stakeholder platform block by block, creating planning spaces where we are either trying to elicit individual subjectivities or trying to facilitate decision-making, consensus, or what's called planning knowledge, and its co-construction of knowledge involves consensus. Next slide, last slide. So participatory land use planning is this way of moving from these individual perceptions, working through consensus, these alternative pathways to a common landscape future. Participatory land use planning has been perceived as a tool for demystifying the planning process, not just for farmers or landscape level actors, and not just to assess their own needs or pull down services, but as capacity building instruments to demonstrate how space is planned and produced, how to see like a state, like an NGO, or like an extension program, and move from landscape perceptions, these reference scenarios, you can click again, these reference scenarios, negotiate alternative pathway scenarios, and arrive at a negotiated normative scenario. So scenario planning by design is intended to plan for multifunctional landscapes as a future condition through integrated landscape management.